A wooden storage drawer in an institution basement holds an envelope of catalogued sediment, a rusted iron trade nail, and a handwritten index card from 1932. The ink records a grid coordinate, a collector's surname, and a single classification noun. The label is wrong. What sits inside the drawer is not discarded mining debris, but the physical record of an entire cultural landscape that official surveys failed to recognize for nearly a century. The anomaly is not that the objects survived, it is that thousands of artifacts sat in plain view across public archives and regional collections, while the institutions holding them misidentified their age, their purpose, and their rightful custodians. How does an authentic cultural object remain completely invisible while sitting on an open museum shelf? Across the continent, collections held in state institutions and regional historical societies contain material whose accepted histories unravel under direct scientific analysis and community scrutiny. This investigation examines 20 distinct objects and archaeological records whose true origins fundamentally reshaped what institutions thought they knew about Australian history. From an iron trade blade recovered from deep dune sands near the western coast to stone arrangements across Victoria documented as natural clearing debris right up to the 1970s, the official record repeatedly substituted a convenient colonial explanation for a much older reality. 20. The Stone Gouge of the Victoria River District. In 1928, pastoral worker Thomas Herbert lodged a heavy, bifacially flaked stone tool with the South Australian Museum in Adelaide. Herbert reported ploughing the artefact out of an alluvial flat along the upper Victoria River in the Northern Territory. The stone was catalogued as a standard Tula adze flake, a routine woodworking tool manufactured throughout the arid zone during the late Holocene. For over 50 years, the specimen remained in a standard timber storage tray, cited in regional typologies as evidence of uniform toolkit distribution. The classification broke down when trace element analysis was applied to the Silcrete matrix in 1984. Researchers from the Australian National University demonstrated that the stone did not originate anywhere within the Victoria River catchment. The geochemical fingerprint matched a single, restricted quarry outcrop in the southern Kimberleys, over 500 kilometres to the west. Microscopic wear patterns along the bevel were entirely inconsistent with scraping dense hardwoods like acacia. The tool had been used exclusively for harvesting and processing aquatic tubers along permanent freshwater channels. Herbert's find was not an ordinary lost domestic tool from a pastoral lease. It was a trade piece transported across an established ceremonial exchange corridor spanning two distinct drainage systems. The assumption that the artifact was a local flake made sense only within a model that treated stone tools as isolated functional objects rather than items moving along defined continental trade networks. 19. The submerged hearth charcoal of the Dampier Archipelago. In 1982, salvage dredging operations near the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia brought up consolidated sediment nodules containing dark organic lenses from 8 metres below the low tide mark. Geological surveyors logged the material as mangrove peat accumulated during mid-Holocene sea level stabilisation around 6,000 years ago, filing the samples as routine evidence of marine inundation. 35 years later, accelerator mass spectrometry redated the organic fraction. The charcoal was not swamp debris. Microscopic analysis of the cellular structure identified it as burnt wood from terrestrial acacia, mixed with crushed marine shell and thermally fractured bone fragments. The sediment was an intact domestic hearth. The radiocarbon determination returned an age exceeding 8,500 calibrated years before present. When that hearth was lit, the coastline sat tens of kilometres further out on the exposed continental shelf, and the current seabed was an elevated valley floor overlooking an open coastal plain. The site represented concrete physical proof of submerged archaeological landscapes preserved beneath modern shipping channels. 18. The lead seal of the Western Dunes. In 1931, drovers moving stock south of Shark Bay found a corroded lead disc stamped with Roman lettering, partially uncovered by shifting sand. Deposited with a regional historical society in Geraldton, staff recorded it as a lost seal from 19th century wool bales. The physical characteristics did not match commercial lead marks of the colonial period. Metallurgical testing conducted by the Western Australian Museum in 1997 revealed an isotopic signature characteristic of 17th century Central European smelting. The disc was an official Dutch merchant bale seal, lost during the survivors' encampment following the wreck of a Verenigde Oost-Indische Company vessel along the reefs of the Houtman Abrolhos. The seal had remained misclassified for 66 years because researchers assumed European material in littoral dunes must date from post-1850 pastoral expansion. The object had been sitting in an open display cabinet, labelled as agricultural refuse, while carrying direct physical evidence of early maritime survival. 17. The painted slate of the Flinders Ranges. A flat slab of flagstone bearing red and white pigment lines was removed from a dry rock shelter in the northern Flinders Ranges in 1914 and forwarded to Adelaide. The collector described it as a decorative colonial hearthstone, assuming geometric patterns were painted by boundary riders using sheep marking rattle. The assumption stood because the rectilinear grids appeared unfamiliar compared to circular motifs documented in Central Australian art. In 1992, pigment spectroscopy identified the red binder not as industrial grease or livestock pigment, but as natural iron oxide bound with plant exudates over a calcium carbonate ground layer. Microstratigraphy showed paint layers had accreted over centuries of periodic maintenance. The slate was a formal boundary marker associated with Adnyamuthana songlines connecting waterholes across the arid ranges. The rectilinear markings recorded precise fracture patterns of local quartzite hills, serving as a mnemonic topographical map. The colonial recorder had looked directly at a cartographic system and seen only a stockman's doodle. 16. The carved wooden dish of Lake Amadeus. In 1953, pastoral workers inspecting boundary fences along the southern margin of Lake Amadeus in the Northern Territory recovered an elongated hardwood bowl buried 50 centimetres beneath a gypsum crust. The station ledger recorded the item as a trough carved by 1920s camel teamsters to hold water. Microscopic wood anatomy conducted by the CSIRO Division of Forest Research in 1989 revealed the vessel was crafted from desert bloodwood, seasoned using low-temperature pit firing. The outer surface carried fluted gouge lines cut with curved stone incisors rather than metal spokeshaves. Direct accelerator radiocarbon dating on resin adhering to the inner lip returned an age of approximately 820 years before present. The vessel had been wrapped in paperbark and placed deliberately into an active evaporite layer. High concentrations of mineral salts desiccated the wood and prevented fungal decay, arresting decomposition for over 8 centuries. The fence riders had classified an ancient ceremonial water carrier as improvised livestock gear simply because it sat along a modern station boundary. 15. The iron trade wedge of King Sound. In 1967, tidal surveying teams working the mudflats of King Sound in the West Kimberley recovered a heavily encrusted iron bar, 30 centimetres long and tapered at one end. Port authorities recorded the item as scrap iron discarded during jetty construction in the 1890s. The object was cleaned by electrolytic reduction at the Western Australian Museum in 2002. Radiographic imaging showed no manganese or modern steel additives. The metal was hand-forged wrought iron, with a slag inclusion profile typical of 18th century Southeast Asian manufacture. The object was a parang blade, altered and traded into coastal Kimberley networks by Macassan trepang fishers who made annual voyages to northern shores across the Arafura Sea long before British settlement. The assumption that metal in coastal mud must stem from colonial construction ignored the dense, seasonal trade routes linking northern Australia to the Indonesian archipelago. The artefact had sat in a workshop drawer for 35 years, catalogued as structural scrap. 14. The silkrete blades of the Curnamona Craton. During mineral exploration drilling north of Alari in South Australia in 1974, field geologists collected a cluster of 18 macro-blade silkrete points from a dry creek bank. The survey recorded the find as natural spalling caused by bushfire heat fracturing an exposed outcrop. In 2006, microware analysis conducted at the Australian Museum in Sydney examined edge fractures under high-magnification scanning electron microscopy. The blades displayed uniform platform preparation, isolated impact bulbs, and lateral retouching characteristic of deliberate pressure flaking. Geochemical testing linked the matrix to quarries over 400 kilometres to the northeast, along the edge of the Strzelecki Desert. The cache was a stored kit of finished trade implements deposited inside an alluvial terrace prior to the mid-Holocene arid shift. The geologists had mistaken sophisticated lithic technology for the effects of heat fracture because they evaluated the stones entirely through a mineralogical lens. 13. The shell ornament of the Nullarbor limestone. In 1939, railway maintenance crews digging a drainage culvert along the Trans-Australian Railway on the Nullarbor Plain uncovered a drilled marine shell plate 40 kilometres inland from the Great Australian Bight. The object was filed as a discarded modern pearl shell button blank from the 1910s. In 1996, malacologists at the South Australian Museum identified the specimen as Mello amphora, a large baler shell native strictly to tropical waters off northern Australia. The shell had been abraded into an oval pendant, drilled with twin suspension holes, and incised with interlocking rectilinear key patterns filled with red ochre. Strontium isotope profiling established that the shell had been harvested near modern-day Broome. The ornament had travelled over 2,000 kilometres across the desert along exchange routes, passing hand-to-hand through dozens of distinct linguistic groups before being cached in the Nullarbor limestone. The transport crew had dismissed an object traversing an entire continent as railway refuse. 12. The basalt channels of the newer volcanics province. For over a century, European settlers in southwestern Victoria described the complex networks of basalt channels near Mount Eccles, known today by its Gunditjmara name Budge Bim, as natural collapsed lava tubes formed during eruptions 30,000 years ago. In 1977, archaeologist Peter Coutts conducted the first systematic survey using low-altitude aerial photography combined with hydrological field mapping. The channels were artificial. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal embedded beneath basalt stone weirs returned ages exceeding 6,600 calibrated years. Gunditjmara engineers had manipulated natural lava flows, constructing hundreds of stone races, holding ponds, and woven funnel traps to manage the breeding and harvesting of short-finned eels across more than 100 square kilometers. Colonial surveyors had viewed an extensive aquaculture system and classified it as an inert geological formation because they believed hunting and gathering left no permanent structural footprint. 11. The submerged grinding groins of Cape Bruguières. In 1994, marine hydrographers surveying shallow reefs off the Dampier archipelago charted an underwater limestone terrace displaying regular geometric depressions. The features were entered into navigational databases as natural solution pans formed by salt weathering. Between 2017 and 2019, the Deep History of Sea Country project deployed high-resolution multi-beam bathymetry, side-scan sonar, and scientific dive teams to map the feature at a depth of 2.4 meters. Underwater archaeologists identified 270 stone artifacts embedded directly into the submerged marine pavement, including basalt cores, anvils, and grinding surfaces. The site sat on land inundated by post-glacial sea level rise 7,000 years ago. A feature recorded as routine seabed topography was an intact submerged workshop. 10. The ochre mine of the Weld Range. In 1971, prospectors assessing iron ore deposits at Wilgie Mere in the Weld Range of Western Australia logged an open-cut pit and cavern system as an early colonial quarry trial from the 1890s. The scale was massive, an excavation extending 20 meters deep and 60 meters wide, with thousands of tons of sheared rock removed. Geological mapping and radiocarbon dating of wooden wedges recovered from deep inside underground galleries by the Western Australian Museum established that the mine had been systematically worked for over 28,000 years. Wajari Yamatji miners had extracted red and yellow specular hematite, hauling it out via scaffolded timber platforms to fuel a trade network extending to the northern coast and central deserts. Prospectors had seen a colossal pre-colonial mine and assumed it was an abandoned European iron claim. 9. The sandstone millstones of the Georgina Basin. In 1963, road crews clearing the path for the Barkly Highway in the Northern Territory bulldozed a cluster of 30 flat sandstone slabs from an open scrub flat, discarding them in a gravel pit as ordinary surface float. The slabs were over 60 centimeters wide, made of quartzitic sandstone foreign to the local limestone geology. In 2001, trace element analysis and thin section petrology conducted by Geoscience Australia matched the quartz matrix to the Mount Isa inlier, over 200 kilometers away. Microscopic residues on stone faces contained starch grains from native millet and sporocarps of the Nardoo fern, bearing impact fracturing from prolonged rotary grinding. The cluster was a regional seed processing depot, abandoned when colonial expansion violently severed access to traditional grain harvesting grounds. 8. The glass blade of the Kimberley Range. In 1978, an archaeological survey near Halls Creek recovered a finely pressure-flaked point with razor-sharp serrated margins from a cave floor. The material was initially logged as translucent volcanic chalcedony. Under optical mineralogy, the material showed isotropic light extinction and spherical air bubbles. It was not mineral stone, but emerald green glass manufactured for telegraph line insulators by the Postmaster General's Department in the 1880s. Jaru Nappers had harvested glass from the overland telegraph line, adapting ancient bifacial pressure flaking techniques to convert the industrial material into surgical-grade spear points and ceremonial exchange blades. The recorder had misclassified an extraordinary piece of technological adaptation as a raw mineral specimen. 7. The carved Boab tree of the Tanami border. In 1910, government surveyors marking the pastoral boundary between Western Australia and the Northern Territory recorded a massive Boab tree bearing deep incisions of letters and symbols. The survey report logged the carvings as initials left by 19th-century cattle drovers travelling along the Murrumbidgee track. When ethnobotanists and Jaru elders re-examined the trunk in 1998, optical bark growth mapping revealed that the oldest markings lay completely sealed beneath several centimetres of callous wood tissue. The incisions were not pastoral livestock brands. They were mnemonic map markers denoting subsurface freshwater soakages and seasonal root caches across 80 kilometres of waterless sandplain. Drovers had carved their own initials over a pre-existing spatial navigation register that had guided desert travel for generations. 6. The edge-ground hatchet of the Sydney Basin sandstone. During excavation work for a building foundation in Parramatta in 1988, contractors uncovered a heavy diorite stone axe head buried 3 metres deep in river alluvium. The municipal engineer classified the piece as river-tumbled ballast gravel discarded from colonial roadworks in the 1840s. Subsequent petrological thin sectioning carried out by the Geological Survey of New South Wales proved that the diorite originated from a quarry near Mount William in Victoria, over 800 kilometres to the southwest. The hatchet had been flaked, pecked and polished into an edge-ground blade before travelling along coastal Wurundjeri and Darug trade lines across the Great Dividing Range. A tool requiring weeks of skilled manufacture and continental exchange had been dismissed as common road ballast because it lay within an urban development trench. 5. The wooden boomerangs of Wiry Swamp. In 1973, peat drainage operations near Millicent in South Australia uncovered several fragments of shaped wood buried beneath 2 metres of saturated peat. The Drainage Authority logged the material as waterlogged timber roots from swamp clearing. Excavations directed by archaeologist Roger Lubers recovered 25 wooden tools, including 9 intact boomerangs carved from she-oak and tea tree. Direct radiocarbon dating of the peat matrix and wood fibres returned ages between 9,000 and 10,000 calibrated years before present. Because anaerobic acidic water had completely excluded oxygen, the delicate wooden implements were preserved in pristine condition from the early Holocene. They remain among the oldest surviving wooden tools anywhere on Earth, recovered from a drain that was nearly dredged out as agricultural waste. 4. The quartzite blade cache of the Simpson Desert. In 1969, seismic exploration crews traversing longitudinal sand dunes in the western Simpson Desert discovered an exposed cache of 72 large quartzite macroblades lying in a deflation pan. The exploration log noted them as wind-fractured silcrete gravel caused by natural thermal expansion. High-resolution microwear and residue analysis at the University of Queensland in 2004 identified traces of mammalian blood proteins and plant resins adhering to the cutting edges. The blades were struck from uniform prepared cores extracted from quarries in the Toko Range, 300 kilometres to the north. They represented a deliberately stored toolkit cached during hyper-arid conditions to process desert game. The seismic crew had driven their tracked vehicles across an intact Holocene provisioning store, recording it as fractured gravel. 3. The submerged chert quarry of Flying Foam Passage. In 1986, hydrographic contractors dredging shipping lanes in the Dampier archipelago charted an elevated reef ledge composed of fractured cryptocrystalline silcrete and chert. The Maritime Survey logged the formation as natural underwater jointing produced by marine wave cavitation. Between 2020 and 2024, archaeologists applying high-resolution sub-bottom seismic profiling and side-scan sonar established that the ledge had been dry land prior to the post-glacial marine transgression approximately 8,400 years ago. Divers recovered thousands of culturally struck flake tools, hammerstones, and cores directly embedded within the intertidal limestone. It was not a broken reef platform. It was an extensive quarry and tool manufacturing workshop submerged under 6 meters of tidal water. The official nautical chart had recorded a submerged production site as a shipping hazard. 2. the earth mounds of the Murray River corridor. Throughout the late 19th century, agricultural survey maps across the central Murray Basin recorded thousands of circular, raised loam mounds rising 1 to 2 meters above the surrounding alluvial clay plains. Pastoralists and state surveyors consistently logged them as natural sand drifts, termite mounds, or debris mounds left by major flood events. Stratigraphic excavation and radiocarbon analysis, conducted by archaeological teams from Flinders University, confirmed that the mounds were constructed human earth ovens. Built repeatedly over 4,000 years by First Nations communities managing regional wetlands, each mound contained tons of heat-retaining clay balls, charcoal, and faunal remains from fish, waterfowl, and subterranean bulrush roots. Colonial surveyors who viewed the landscape through an assumption of nomadic wandering saw thousands of permanent food processing installations and recorded them as wind-blown silt. 1. The lunette burials of the Willandra Lakes. In 1968, a geologist mapping dry lake beds in southwestern New South Wales came across burnt, carbonate-encrusted bone fragments weathering out of a sand lunette at Lake Mungo. The material was initially assumed to be the remains of 19th-century pastoral burials or modern animal bones exposed by wind erosion. When physical anthropologist Alan Thorne and archaeologist Jim Bowler completed laboratory reconstruction at the Australian National University, the truth fundamentally shifted the timeline of human history. The remains, known as Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, represented formal ceremonial cremations and ochre interments dated securely to 42,000 years before present. They are among the oldest ritually buried human remains on Earth. For generations, pastoralists had driven sheep over the sand dunes, assuming the white fragments eroding in the wind were the ordinary refuse of the 19th century. The anomaly was never that the landscape hid these places. The official record could not see them because colonial science assumed that a culture without masonry left no durable infrastructure upon the ground. What remains unresolved is how much of this record continues to degrade in silence. Active coastal development, deep tillage agriculture, and tidal erosion destroy hundreds of unrecorded hearths and stone arrangements each year before instruments can register their presence. State archives and regional museums still hold thousands of unstudied drawers containing mislabeled stone and bone fragments that have never undergone modern isotopic or petrological testing. The published map sheet gives the impression of a country fully measured, subdivided, and understood. The ground beneath it tells a completely different story. Which unrecognized landmark or strange landscape anomaly in your own state or territory has always made you question the official history on the plaque? Let me know in the comments below, and consider subscribing to follow our deep investigations into the hidden geography of this continent.